It's time for charting futures. Here's Abigail Doolittle. And Abigail, you're looking at pivots and options on futures.
Indeed we are, Joe, pivots and options. But first, let's take a look at what we have going on cross-asset class from futures and also spot. Take a look at the S&P 500, up 0.6%. The NASDAQ 100 really soaring, up 1% as investors look past the possibility that the coronavirus tragedy could really dent the global economic picture. Crude oil is in on the risk rally, up 2.5%. And take a look at the dollar yen. This is really extraordinary, down up 1.4%. That means the Haven yen down 1.4%. Right now, possibly on pace for its worst day since March, but certainly on pace for its worst day since August. So risk on, investors piling into those risk assets, out of the Haven assets. Now, we've had a number of traders join us recently on Charting Futures talking about the Haven yen, liking it. Let's take a look at that chart here in the Bloomberg terminal. And what we're looking at, these are yen futures. So this is price. It does not trade inverse to the direction. So when yen futures go higher, that means that Haven demand is actually there. So over the last couple of years, you do see the yen futures in this range, but lower highs on bottom, suggesting that it's somewhat bullish. The RSI perhaps coordinating to that. So we've had a lot of traders thinking that we could go up to 95 or 100 on yen futures. Today, though, we're starting to move just below that range slightly. You'd want to see it happen for a while for it to be a confirmed move to the downside, which would presumably be risk on. To talk more about this and risk assets, how you might play the inverse side of havens, I'd like to bring in Mike Regan here of Bloomberg News. Thank you, Mike, for joining us. And Mike, what do you think about that yen chart?
Well, it's a very interesting chart. That 100 level certainly seems to be like a lid if we do get another risk-off session with some sort of coronavirus headline. So definitely interesting chart to keep an eye on.
It certainly is, because if you're right, if we do get some bad headlines, and hopefully we don't, but if we did, it could certainly pop back up into that range. It's been pretty reliable. Let's turn now to the E-mini futures and pivots. Joe was talking about how we're going to talk about pivots. I don't know too much about pivots, so please educate me and our viewers.
Yeah, so pivot points are basically just trying to identify a spot on the chart where an asset price will sort of reverse the trend it was in. And the ones I have today are courtesy of Jeff York, who runs a subscription service called Pivotal Pivots. Now, the bottom one is pretty simple. It's a weekly pivot, and all it is the average of the previous week's high, low, and closing price. And you can see right below 3360 there, it has sort of been a pretty good support level for the S&P. The upper one, the math gets a little bit more complicated, but again, you can see that 3390 level is a pretty sticky point for the March S&P E-mini futures for the moment. Now, Jeff is not sure that will hold. He thinks it could breach that level and get as high as 3405 to 3412. He says that's where sort of the weekly and monthly pivots converge, and he thinks there's a lot of algos that would trade there and sort of cap the index at that level.
So relatively quickly then, one way to possibly play that with relatively less capital on the table would be call options on the E-mini futures, and you have a chart, in fact, of this. Actually, that is not this chart. This was the yen chart that we were looking at, but if we were to take a look at call futures, that's a bullish picture.
Right, so the $3,400 calls on the S&P March futures are the most active calls today. And again, looking at Jeff York and how he views these pivot points, he thinks since options are expiring this Friday, that 34, you can see the price really shooting higher as we get closer to that. Also, that volume getting very high on the bottom bars there. So he's thinking that all else being said, that 3,400 level could be sort of a magnet for the futures because of this heavy option interest at that level.